The city you think you know never existed. Not the gleaming white marble. Not the pristine robes. Not the Hollywood version where everyone speaks with a British accent and the streets are wide enough for chariots to pass. That city is a comfortable lie. The real Jerusalem smelled like donkey dung, olive oil, and the coppery residue of sacrifice. The real Nazareth was a cluster of mud brick hovels so small that a modern apartment dweller would refuse to store their winter coats there. The real Jericho sat in a heat so oppressive that its residents built their lives around the mercy of a single spring. This is not ancient history. This is the story of survival, of a people pressed between empire and prophecy, of a world that existed for a single generation before being erased so completely that archaeologists now call its final moment the destruction layer. In the next few minutes, you will walk those narrow streets. You will smell the smoke of the evening lamps. You will understand why darkness was a terror and why a single well could determine a woman's entire social standing. And by the end, you will ask yourself a question that has no comfortable answer. Does this feel like 2,000 years ago, or does it feel like something that could happen tomorrow? Let us begin where the sun rises over the Judean hills, in a village so insignificant that its own neighbors mocked it. Nazareth was not a town. It was barely a suggestion. 200 people, maybe 300 on a generous count, clustered on a hillside in Lower Galilee, invisible to the Roman maps that mattered, absent from the writings of historians who documented the important places. When Nathanael heard that someone significant had come from Nazareth, his response was the ancient equivalent of a snort. Can anything good come from there? He was not being cruel. He was being accurate. The houses of Nazareth were not built. They were grown, carved partially into the limestone hillside. Their back walls were living rock. Their front walls were mud brick, mixed with straw and animal hair, dried in the relentless Galilean sun until they hardened into something that could withstand a season or two before crumbling. These were not white. Nothing was white. The romantic vision of pristine ancient cities comes from Renaissance painters who had never seen the Middle East. The reality was brown, dust brown, earth brown, the color of camouflage, because a village that blended into the hillside was a village that raiders might overlook. The streets were not streets. They were gaps. Passages barely wide enough for two people to pass if they turned sideways. This was intentional. A narrow alley is a defensible alley. An invader cannot charge through a gap that forces him to enter single file. Would you sacrifice convenience for survival? They did. Every day, in every design choice. The homes themselves were fortresses in miniature. No windows faced outward. Light came from a single door, and perhaps a small opening in the roof for smoke. The walls were thick, not for insulation but for defense. A mud brick wall can be dug through, but a thick mud brick wall takes time. Time enough to wake. Time enough to scream. Time enough for neighbors to come with whatever weapons they had. And here is where the architecture reveals something that changes everything you thought you knew about a certain story. The homes were split level. Not in the modern sense of elegant steps between living spaces, but in the practical sense of a peasant engineer solving an impossible problem. The floor was dirt. The lower section, perhaps a foot or two below the main living area, was where the animals slept. Goats. Wow. A donkey, if the family was fortunate. Chickens scratching in the corner. Above them, on a raised stone platform covered with woven mats, the family slept. Parents. Children, dot. Grandparents. Sometimes aunts, uncles, cousins, all in one room, all breathing the same air that rose from the animals below. This was not poverty. This was engineering. The animals were biological heating. Their body warmth rose through the night, keeping the family alive during the cold Galilean winters when temperatures dropped near freezing. The arrangement also protected the animals from theft and predators, and it kept the family's most valuable assets within arm's reach. Now consider what you have been told about a birth in Bethlehem. A stable, a manger, isolation. God. The truth is more crowded and more human. A manger was not a separate building. It was a feeding trough in the lower section of an ordinary home. When a young couple arrived in an overcrowded town during a census, they did not find themselves alone in a barn. They found themselves in the animal section of a relative's home because the raised sleeping platform was already full. The baby was laid in the manger because that was the only flat surface available. He was not isolated from humanity. He was surrounded by it, by the sounds of a family sleeping above, by the warmth of animals breathing beside him, by the reality of what it meant to be born into the world of the poor. Does that change the story for you? It should. It changes everything. Privacy did not exist. This is not an exaggeration or a metaphor. In villages like Nazareth and even in the crowded quarters of Jerusalem, privacy was a concept as foreign as ice in summer. The houses were pressed together, wall against wall, roof against roof, partly for structural integrity, since mud brick lasts longer when it has something to lean against, partly for defense, since a connected row of homes is harder to burn than isolated structures, and partly because land inside the village walls was precious, and every inch had to count. The result was auditory surveillance. Every argument was public. Every illness was known. Every birth was attended by the sounds of neighbors listening through thin walls. A woman could not weep without the village knowing her sorrow. A man could not raise his voice without the community judging his temper. This created a social pressure that modern people can barely comprehend. Your reputation was not built on what you chose to reveal. It was built on what you could not hide. And nowhere was this pressure more visible than at the well. Water was life. Every drop had to be carried. Every family sent someone, usually a woman, to draw from the village well or the nearest spring. This was back-breaking work. Heavy clay jars, steep paths. The trip had to be made daily, sometimes twice. But the well was more than a water source. It was a tribunal. Women gathered in the early morning before the heat became unbearable. They came in groups. They talked. They shared news. They assessed each other. Who was sick? Who was pregnant? Whose husband had been seen speaking with whom? The well was where social standing was established and destroyed. The timing of your arrival spoke volumes. Come with a group, and you belonged. Come early, and you were eager, perhaps desperate for news. Come at noon, in the crushing heat, when no sensible person ventured out, and you were an outcast. Remember the story of a woman at a well in Samaria? Alone, drawing water in the worst heat of the day. This was not random. She was avoiding the other women. She was hiding from the judgment that would meet her if she arrived when they did. Her presence at that hour told every listener exactly what kind of woman she was before she spoke a single word. Do you choose your timing to avoid certain people? Do you know others who do the same? Some things never change. Nazareth was insignificant, but 6 kilometers away stood something that was not. Zephyrus, a Roman metropolis. a gleaming example of imperial power planted in the middle of Galilee like a fist. Theaters, bathhouses, columns of imported marble, streets laid out in grids, mosaics so elaborate that archaeologists call one depicting a woman the Mona Lisa of the Galilee. 6 kilometers, an hour's walk for a working man. The contrast was designed to humiliate. In Nazareth, you slept with goats. In Sepphoris, wealthy Romans reclined on cushions while slaves poured wine. In Nazareth, you ate bread baked on stones heated by animal dung. In Sepphoris, you could purchase delicacies imported from across the Mediterranean. And here is what the comfortable distance of history often obscures. The people of Nazareth did not merely see Sepphoris from afar. They built it. When you needed construction workers, you hired from the surrounding villages. When you needed carpenters, stonemasons, manual laborers willing to work for Roman coins, you sent word to the tiny settlements in the hills. A carpenter from Nazareth would have walked to Sepphoris. He would have worked on Roman buildings. He would have heard Greek spoken in the markets. He would have seen the theaters where pagan performances celebrated gods his people called abominations. This was not isolation. This was immersion. Every day, the laborers of Galilee walked into the empire and back out again. They spoke Aramaic at home and learned enough Greek to take orders. They worshipped the God of Abraham and built temples to the deities of Rome. They lived in the collision zone between worlds, and the empire made certain they never forgot who was in charge. The law of the mile. A Roman soldier could stop any civilian and demand that they carry his equipment, his pack, his weapons, his gear, whatever he was tired of hauling himself. The law specified 1 mile. After that, you could set down the burden and walk away. Imagine it. You are walking home after a day of labor. Your muscles ache. Your stomach is empty. You are thinking about your children, your meal, your rest. And a soldier, armored and armed, points at you and drops his pack at your feet. You have no choice. Refusal means a beating. Or worse, you carry his burden. 1 mile. Then you are released to continue your journey, later than you planned, more exhausted than you were, reminded in your bones that you are not free. This happened every day to ordinary people, in ordinary circumstances. Is it any wonder the land was a powder keg? You do not understand the darkness. Modern humans have lost the ability to comprehend what night meant before electricity. We flip switches. We carry glowing rectangles in our pockets. We move through darkness as if it were a minor inconvenience, a filter we can remove with the touch of a finger. For them, night was a predator. When the sun dropped below the western hills, work stopped. There was no choice. You cannot farm by feel. You cannot build by memory. The darkness was absolute in a way that most modern people have never experienced. Not dim, not shadowy. Absolute. 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 And light was expensive. Oil lamps burned olive oil. The same oil you cooked with. The same oil you traded for grain and cloth. Every hour you kept a lamp burning was an hour of food you would not eat. Most families chose hunger. Most families sat in blackness, feeling their way to their sleeping mats, listening to the sounds of animals settling below them, waiting for the dawn. Those who could afford light guarded it carefully. The small clay lamps were designed to burn slowly, to stretch the oil as far as it could go. Still, the circle of illumination they cast was tiny, a few feet at most. Beyond that ring of flickering warmth, the world disappeared. And in that darkness, the thieves came. not through the door. Doors could be barred, blocked, defended. A door was the obvious entry point, and everyone knew to protect it. The thieves dug. The walls were mud brick, hardened dirt. A determined man with a few hours of darkness could carve through the back wall of a house while the family slept. He could reach through the hole he made and take whatever his hands found. He could be gone before the first light revealed the damage. This is why you were warned to build on rock and not on sand. This is why treasure was not stored where thieves could dig through. Every metaphor had teeth. And outside the village walls, the darkness held worse things. Wolves, banditi, bandits, the desperate and the deranged who could not survive within the structures of society and so waited in the wild places for the foolish, the late, the unlucky. The city gates closed at sunset. This was not a suggestion. This was survival. When the sun touched the horizon, the gates swung shut, and they did not open again until dawn. If you were late, you stayed outside. If you were outside, you took your chances. Do you lock your doors at night? Do you check them twice? That instinct is older than you know. Jerusalem was different. Jerusalem was everything. The temple rose from the center of the city like a declaration. White stone, gold trim that caught the morning sun and threw it back into the sky. The largest religious structure in the Roman world. A building so massive that the platform on which it stood required engineering that still impresses modern architects. 3 times a year, the population exploded. Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles. Pilgrims from across the Jewish world poured into a city designed for perhaps 50,000 people. Some estimates suggest the festival population swelled to 200,000, perhaps more. Picture it. The narrow streets choked with bodies. The markets overflowing with animals for sacrifice. The smell of incense mixing with the smell of manure, mixing with the smell of human sweat. The noise of 100 languages, because Jews came from everywhere the empire touched, and they brought their accents with them. The Romans watched from the Antonia fortress, built directly adjacent to the Temple Mount. They could see into the sacred courtyards. They could deploy troops in minutes if a disturbance began. They were always watching, always ready, always reminding the city who held the real power. And the city remembered. Every generation had its martyrs. Every family had its stories of resistance. The memory of the Maccabees who had thrown off an earlier empire burned in the collective consciousness. Messiah was not an abstract concept. Messiah was a hope that someone someday would do it again. The tension was constant. Religious zealots preached liberation. Roman sympathizers counseled accommodation. The Sadducees controlled the temple and collaborated with the occupiers. The Pharisees emphasized personal piety and waited for divine intervention. The Essenes had withdrawn to the desert entirely, convinced that the whole system was too corrupt to reform. Everyone was waiting for something, for someone. Would you have joined the resistance? Would you have counseled patience? Would you have hopped away entirely? What would you do if you were living in a place that everyone knew was about to explode? The explosion came in the year 66. A series of provocations. A series of responses. The usual spiral of insult and retaliation that turns grievance into war. The details matter less than the outcome. Rome decided to end the Jewish problem permanently. 4 legions marched into Judea. 20,000 professional soldiers backed by auxiliaries, siege engineers, and the full industrial capacity of the greatest military machine the ancient world had ever produced. Jerusalem held out for 4 years. Think about that. A city under siege for 4 years. the walls holding, the defenders refusing to surrender, the slow strangulation as food supplies dwindled, as water became precious, as hope curdled into something darker. The historian Josephus, who was there, who survived because he switched sides at the right moment, recorded what happened inside those walls. Famine toiled you. Families ate leather. They ate grass. They ate things that should never be described in a document intended for general audiences. The streets that had been choked with festival pilgrims were now silent except for the dying. The markets that had overflowed with sacrificial animals were empty. The city that had been so loud, so alive, so crowded that privacy was impossible, became a graveyard with people still walking through it. And then, in the summer of the year 70, the walls fell. The Roman soldiers poured through. They had been patient for 4 years. They had lost comrades to Jewish resistance. They were not inclined toward mercy. The temple burned. Whether by accident or design, the historians still argue. The gold that decorated the sanctuary melted in the heat and ran down into the cracks between the stones. When the flames died, Roman soldiers realized that a fortune had pooled in those seams. So they dismantled the temple, stone by stone, prying apart the massive blocks that had stood for generations, scraping the gold from every surface, every crevice, every gap. Not one stone was left upon another. This was not prophecy in the mystical sense. This was greed doing the work that prophecy had promised. Today, if you dig beneath the streets of modern Jerusalem, you will find it. Archaeologists call it the destruction layer, a band of ash, blackened stone, arrowheads, broken pottery, the physical residue of the moment when one world ended and another began. Above that layer, everything is different. The city that rose from the ruins was not the city that had fallen. The people who eventually returned were not the people who had fled. The religion that survived was not the religion that had centered on sacrifice and temple and priesthood. Below the layer, you find the world we have been walking through. The narrow streets, the crowded markets, the oil lamps and the mud brick walls and the social dynamics that governed every interaction from the well at noon to the festivals that brought the diaspora home. Above the layer, you find the foundations of something else entirely. A world without the temple. A Judaism that had to reinvent itself around text and prayer instead of sacrifice. A Christianity that spread not from Jerusalem, but from the scattered communities that had formed before the destruction. That layer is a boundary, a line drawn in ash between what was and what came after. And the world that existed beneath it is gone so completely that we have to reconstruct it from fragments, from archaeology, from documents written by survivors who had their own agendas, from inference and imagination and the occasional artifact that surfaces when construction crews dig too deep. This is what haunts me, not the violence, not the destruction, not even the suffering, though all of it was real and all of it matters. What haunts me is how normal it all was before the end. People woke up. They lit their lamps if they could afford the oil. They sent their daughters to the well and their sons to the fields. They argued with their neighbors and gossiped about their relatives and worried about the Romans and hoped for something better. They lived in a world that felt permanent, that had always been there, that would, they assumed, always be there. And then it was gone. Not gradually, not with warning enough to prepare. Gone in a single generation. The people who remembered Nazareth as a village and Jerusalem as the center of the world lived long enough to see both become memories. Does that feel like ancient history to you? Does that feel safely distant? Or does it feel like something that could happen to the world you know? Think about it. The infrastructure you depend on, The systems you assume will continue. The rhythms of daily life that feel so permanent that you rarely question them. All of it rests on foundations you never see. And beneath every city, in every era, there is a destruction layer waiting to be made. This is Christopher, reminding you that history is not a list of dates. It is not a collection of facts to be memorized and forgotten. History is the story of people who were just as real as you, just as certain of their world, just as convinced that their lives mattered and their futures were secure. They were right about mattering. They were wrong about security. And so probably are we. Until next time, walk carefully, look closely, and remember that the world beneath your feet has layers you have never seen.